Good evening, everyone. Or if you're watching this on YouTube or elsewhere, it may be morning or any other time. But welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club Hong Kong online Zoom events. Today I'm really excited about today's event. But before I get to that, I want you to know that please keep an eye on our website because we have a lot of upcoming events. We have something coming up on Tuesday, the 22nd of February, which I'm sure all of you will be interested in. It's about Hong Kong's new COVID-19 reality. And we've got two really interesting guests, Dr. Karen Gripan from the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong, and also Dr. Ivan Hung, who's an endowed professor in health sciences, and as well as a professor of medicine at the Li Ka-shing Faculty of Medicine. So that's going to be a different time than normal. That's going to be at noon coming up next Tuesday, the 22nd. I'm Keith Richburg. I'm the president of the FCC, and I'm very, very excited about today's event. We all want to know what's happening in China. Nobody knows. It's a black box for many of us here. I personally haven't been able to travel to Beijing since 2019. There's a lot going on. They're just getting through the Olympics. I think there's about another few days to go in the Olympics. We hear all kinds of questions about China's COVID policy, China's debt policy, what's going to happen with the 20th Party Congress coming up. We don't know the answers to any of these things, but our guest does, and he's going to tell us everything we need to know. Wang Xiangwei is a veteran journalist. He became the first China-born editor of the South China Morning Post, and he held that job until 2015. He's also worked at the China Daily. He worked in the UK at BBC and other places, and he just went back to Beijing around 2015, 2016. And he's now in Beijing as a columnist for the South China Morning Post. And if you don't read Wang Xiangwei, you don't know what's going on in China. And he's going to answer all of our questions here. So first of all, let me say a big welcome to you, Wang Xiangwei, for giving us the view from Beijing.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith, for having me.
Okay, you're very welcome. And can I just start out with a kind of an open-ended question? Because, when I read what's written about China in the overseas media or by think tanks, by foreign policy associations, I see two very different things. They sound contradictory. On the one hand, I hear that China is at the peak of its power. China is about to surpass the United States in the next decade as the world's largest economy. President Xi Jinping is at the peak of his power and is about to get an unprecedented third term. China is, astride the global stage now more than ever before, and this is the century of China, and while the West is in decline. The other thing I hear is, China's got a lot of problems. Look, they're going to have to emerge from COVID at some point. Their economy is going to be wrecked when that happens. They can't keep having these lockdowns. They're dealing with a huge debt crisis. They're dealing with a huge demographic crisis. All is not well in the People's Republic of China. And these things are polar opposites, but maybe you can just tell us which of these views of China is the accurate one.
Okay. Thank you very much, Keith, for having me. This is my second time that I have been invited to speak at FCC events. Back in 2012, soon after I became the editor-in-chief, of the SCMP, I spoke at the FCC for the first time. Really cannot believe that it has been 10 years already. Hopefully, my next one will not take that long. Of course, that depends on whether you would like to have me again after this one.
Absolutely.
I think the question you have just asked, I think that's a great question, regarding the contradictions and the myths about China, particularly about how China is perceived overseas and what is really happening in the country. And that's also the question I got asked a lot in the recent years when I met with the diplomats, fellow foreign journalists, and the foreign businessmen in Beijing or Hong Kong. Well, indeed, every day we see two distinctively different versions of China being reported on the overseas media and the state media. In China, as you mentioned, with President Xi set to seek a third term in office, the state media has gone into overdrive about how China under his leadership, will grow the economy into a greener and innovative future, and with China overtaking the U.S. as the world's largest economy by 2028 or the earliest, or 2030. By contrast, abroad, as you mentioned, the dire warnings about the Chinese economy have intensified, including the challenges you have mentioned, and also China is widely seen as becoming more authoritarian, nationalistic, and turning inwards, as well as becoming more assertive in its foreign policies. I think both of versions have only presented parts of the whole picture. For instance, talking about the economy, these days, China China often boasts that it has a middle class of 400 million people, and the number is growing. And this would provide a new engine of growth for the economy and a bonanza for the foreign investors. But, back in 2020, Premier Li Keqiang said that more than 600 million people in China live on a meager monthly income of 1,000 yuan a month. And, as the Chinese leaders, including Xi himself, often say that to gain a better understanding of China, one must have a good understanding of the Communist Party, the CCP. I guess following that logic, to understand today's CCP well, one must have some good understanding of Xi himself. I guess that's the part which generates the most interest, but also the biggest controversy. But, so I would like to take a few minutes to talk about this, and because it has profound implications on how people in the West, in the rest of the world, see China and its future. Earlier this month, I saw a CNN video report of George Soros' latest speech at a Hoover Institute seminar, about his constant refrain these days that China is facing both political and economic crisis, and its growth model centering on the real estate is unsustainable. The property bubble has burst with the collapse of several major Chinese property companies, including Evergrande. And he also mentioned something about Omicron is Xi Jinping's undoing. And he said that strong opposition within the CCP means that Xi will never attain the level of Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong in the annals of the CCP history. And, as you know, another prevailing theory is that Xi is desperate to cling to power for his own survival, partly because his anti-corruption campaign to consolidate his power has ruffled so many feathers among the elites, and he fears retaliation if he steps down soon. Another constant speculation is that Xi himself wants to take China backwards into the era of egalitarianism in the 1950s and 60s, citing his new slogan, common prosperity. But that's not how I have seen and felt, on the ground in Beijing. I would like to talk about his third term. I have no doubt whatsoever that he will succeed in receiving the third term with little opposition. If the adoption of the third historical resolution in the history of CCP's 100 years is any indicator, it just approves the adoption. It just approves that he has support of the party's elites, contrary to what Soros and others believe. As you know, that only two other historical resolutions have been adopted in the CCP's 100 years. The first one by Mao Zedong in 1945, that resolution consolidated his power to create at the party and help him to lead the Red Army to create modern China. And the second, by Deng Xiaoping after the Cultural Revolution, and that resolution built the foundation for the country's reform and opening up. That in turn paved the way for China's economic liftoff and subsequently become the world's second largest economy. And now Xi's third resolution. The Chinese media is fond of saying that Mao has made the Chinese stand up, and Deng Xiaoping has made the Chinese people rich, and Xi will make China stronger and equal with the United States. I mean, in the world, I heard some analysts have said this, and I think it makes sense that in a sense that Xi wants to become another Mao, without making the colossal mistakes Mao made in the 1950s and 60s. Of course, China's political system is such that once at the top, there are fewer checks and balances, and also China's opaque politics and lack of transparency have made understanding China even more difficult. And all these have caused worries at home and abroad. And for instance, the latest example is the scandal involving Peng Shuai and Zhang Gaoli, the former Politburo Standing Committee member. And the way the Chinese government has handled this incident has, in my opinion, sort of has damaged China's reputation and image. As I said to David Barboza in the interview last year for his magazine, The Wire China, unlike democracies, Western democracies, where people can choose their governments through the ballot box. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party, even though it's a dictatorship, it must earn the legitimacy of ruling by demonstrating that it delivers, or it risks losing the support and the confidence of the people. I mean, the history, the Chinese history has shown time again the disastrous consequence of rulers losing the trust of his peoples. I mean, in my opinion, that I think Xi believes, and the Chinese and other Chinese officials have said the same thing, that so long as China focuses on managing its own affairs well, that the Chinese economy will continue to grow strongly. And so that's how what we are right now. And of course, if you look at just one part of China, if you look for the negatives, there were so many. But if you look at the positives, and then you will see China still has a very strong growth potential in terms of consumption and in terms of further opening up to foreign investments. I mean, as they say, we live in interesting times.
It's interesting, and by the way, for all of you in the audience there listening live, if you've got a question, please send it to question, singular, question@fccHK.org, and I'll try to get as many of them as I can to our speaker. But I want to ask you a lot more about China. But before we do that, look, at the moment, at the time we're recording this, everybody is concerned here about COVID in Hong Kong. We just saw an explosion of 6,000 plus cases today, another 6,000 or more preliminary cases. We've had 24 deaths in the last week or so, unprecedented. I want to know, you're in Beijing, Xiangwei, how does Beijing view this going on here? And And secondly, what do we make of the fact that President Xi came out and said that the local government must make this the top priority and Hong Kong people has his support? I mean, do we interpret that as a rallying cry for the Hong Kong people, or do we interpret this as you better do a better job, Hong Kong? We're very confused here, and you can shed some light for us.
Okay. Thank you, Keith. I'll try. But before I get to that, I would like to talk about this sort of little interesting story that really, I find it really fascinating. I'm not sure you have read that sort of story about a group of at least 15 Hong Kong residents illegally sneaking back from Hong Kong to Zhuhai on the early hours of Monday morning. On what is, you have read it. Yeah, on what is most likely to be smugglers' favorite high-power speedboats, known as Da Fei. I mean, two young girls in their 20s were quarantined in Guangzhou after spending a day shopping and dining at various hotels and malls. And another couple drove to Chenzhou of Hunan before they were quarantined. And now, I read something on the internet today that Zhuhai has now put up a reward of 100,000 yuan for any tip leading to the seizure of those people smuggling boats. And authorities in Huizhou, another city in Guangdong, increased the rewards to 500,000 yuan. And I have seen photos on the social media of Chinese workers on the side of Shenzhen now putting up barbed wires along the border. And there also have been reports of hundreds of Hong Kong residents who failed to obtain the daily quota for crossing the border, but go to the crossing point at Daya Bay anyway, wait for 10 hours or more, hoping to get across to Shenzhen. I mean, all those stories have become viral on the Chinese social media, not the least because in the past, this people smuggling business usually went one way from the Chinese mainland to Hong Kong. I think just, this sort of little story sort of is one of the many reasons that the Chinese government has decided to put the Hong Kong on notice by taking a very unusual step of making public Xi's instruction in Hong Kong that Hong Kong must mobilize all resources and all forces and take all necessary measures to curb the outbreak. I think the Xi's instruction is significant on several levels. The first one is obviously, as I said earlier, to put Carrie Lam and the rest of her people on notice. The second is to stiffen the spines of local officials and, to dismiss the thoughts and lobbying about living with the COVID. And the third one is to remind local officials of the need to bury their differences and unite their thinking and stop the infighting and give their 100% behind the fight against the virus. As you mentioned earlier, and others have, also pointed out that making the Chinese government decision to make public Xi's instruction is indeed very unusual. I mean, because of, as I mentioned earlier, because of China's opaque politics and lack of transparency, the Chinese authorities have rarely made public Xi's instructions on anything. Even though he probably issues numerous instructions every day, as he rules by fiat. Officials and official media always, say that, whenever they do something, their standard line is that, they will strictly adhere to the spirit of Xi's instructions on issues, but without getting full details, what he says exactly. I mean, of course, for propaganda purposes, Xi's instructions are made public. Whenever there was a major accident or a disaster, and then the state media will immediately reports what his instruction on how to help the people in need and all that. So, and of course that he's making public his instruction also carries significant political implications. I guess Carrie Lam's political future, if he still wants to seek the second term, hands on whether he could succeed in containing the outbreak. With the benefit of hindsight, I think Beijing's frustration with the way the Carrie Lam's administration tackled the latest outbreak, sort of Beijing's frustration started to show up soon after the fifth wave of outbreak struck Hong Kong late last year. I think the fifth wave started in late December, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then, I think the officials in Beijing, from what I learned, they were sort of dismayed that Carrie Lam, not necessarily Carrie herself, that the officials in Hong Kong, they all publicly stated that they would follow the dynamic zero COVID policy. But in fact, the Chinese officials suspect that, the Hong Kong officials had been half-hearted in implementation of the dynamic zero COVID policy, partly because, it's sort of a quite prevailing sentiment in Hong Kong among many people that they held hopes that Hong Kong would be like Singapore. Singapore has chosen to open up borders and adopted the policy of living with the virus. And so as early as February the 7th, now with the benefit of hindsight, that the People's Daily carried a very interesting commentary and saying that dynamic zero COVID policy is the only scientific option for Hong Kong, and that commentary accused certain people in the city who called for living with the COVID irresponsible. And then Tian Feilong, is a very outspoken mainland academic on Hong Kong issues, and he said in an interview with the Hong Kong newspaper just published on Monday that he was very harsh, and he said something to the effect that the Hong Kong officials lack apathy for the Hong Kong people's feelings, and in their half-hearted fight against outbreak. And he warns in that interview that if Hong Kong followed the Western countries, well, the rest of the world really, in easing COVID restrictions and opting for the policy of living with the COVID, that this will see Hong Kong drift further away from the mainland, and Hong Kong will pay a huge price for failing to integrating into the national strategy. It's very stern warning indeed. But I would like to point out that while it is very unusual for Beijing to make public Xi's instruction, it is equally unusual about the way Xi's instruction was made public. As you know, Xi's instruction was splashed on the front pages of Wen Huibao and Da Gongbao on Wednesday, instead of the usual way. The usual way is that the Chinese government will have the Xinhua News Agency to release news, and that news will be first reported on the CCTV's 新闻联播 7 p.m. news. As a way to monitor the political developments in China. I watched the CCTV 新闻联播 7 p.m. news religiously. This program is relayed by all TV news stations across the country. it is the premier news platform to feel the political pulse these days. And you know, over the past 2 years, every day, Xi's speech or activities monopolize the top 3 or 4 items. But his instruction for Hong Kong, as significant as it is, was not mentioned on the CCTV news yesterday. And I checked the Xinhua websites and the People's Daily, neither did other major state media outlets sort of reported about this. So, you know, I guess that the Chinese leadership does not want this to become a national issue. I mean, I think Xi and other Chinese officials have made it very clear that this is a Hong Kong problem, that the Hong Kong government should bear the primary responsibility. And if I read the tea leaves correctly, I think Xi's call is also to prod the officials in Beijing and Guangdong to take immediate action. I think, you know, because of China's strict COVID policy, that every province, every city, you know, every town in China has a heavy task load, you know, already on tackling and guarding against their, you know, local outbreaks. I think only Xi's instruction, you know, will get the officials in Guangdong, the officials in the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office, the officials in the Central Liaison Office will get their full attention and get them to work on this. So I think, you know, what is going to happen next? I think many have speculated, you know, whether Hong Kong is heading for a citywide lockdown. I don't think it's very likely in the near future. I mean, the reasons are simple. The city lacks the manpower and the resources to implement effective citywide lockdown, even with the help from the mainland. I mean, you know, Hong Kong is very much different from the Chinese cities of Wuhan or Xi'an, where the citywide lockdown took place. I mean, you know, those cities, you know, have very extensive grassroots organizations. You know, they're everywhere. You know, they were responsible for delivering foods, you know, medicine. And also, I think John Lee, our chief secretary, has publicly ruled out that option. I mean, you know, for the moment, I think, I mean, a citywide lockdown can only be the last resort. You know, only after the upcoming control measure fail. I think what Hong Kong will do is to learn from the mainland cities by gracefully ramping up mandatory testing and quarantine facilities, and gracefully ramping up contact tracing, and probably build more makeshift hospitals for the patients with light symptoms, and to prevent them from infecting others. You know, I saw some images on the internet about some patients just sort of lying in a on a cot on the street. You know, I think the sort of makeshift hospitals are very much necessary, and I guess in the coming days, you know, you are probably going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese medical personnel will come to Hong Kong to assist on testing and quarantine and contact tracing, and probably building more makeshift hospitals. I think there were already reports saying that, you know, Hong Kong now is planning for a 3 citywide test of all the people who live in Hong Kong for the moment. And according to a Xinhua report today, the first batch of medical professionals from Guangdong, along with their mobile COVID test vans, have already arrived in Hong Kong earlier today. And then, you know, of course, you know, with all this happen, you know, sort of people are wondering whether Xi's election scheduled for next month will be postponed. I think it's still too early to say. I mean, it really depends on how soon the government can contain the outbreak. I mean, Xi has made it very clear that's the only priority. That's the overarching sort of priority. I mean, he's, if we read that line correctly, he would say, he probably telling the Hong Kong officials, don't worry about the election, fix this thing first. Well,
can I ask you a question right there, though? Because in other places we've seen, Wuhan, Xi'an, which you've mentioned, when you've seen this kind of explosion of cases, when you see what we see here now in Hong Kong, people waiting outside, they're cold, they're waiting on gurneys, local officials have been sacked. The central government steps in and they get rid of the local government and they say, we're going to come in and help you.
Yeah.
Does this sound to you like this government's going to get reappointed for a second term? Read the tea leaves and put on your political prognosis hat.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, Keith. I don't think we have reached that level yet. I mean, it was, if you look back, I mean, it only happened once in Wuhan. When the outbreak first started in China, that later on the party secretary of Hubei and the party secretary of Wuhan were sort of sacked. But in other cities, like in Xi'an, which was locked down not long ago, I mean, it's only the officials in charge of healthcare were reprimanded. I think that Hong Kong is a little bit sort of different in the as far as Beijing is concerned. That's why I said earlier that the fact that the Chinese leaders, I mean, the Chinese propaganda officials, did not play up Xi's instruction for Hong Kong on the national media. I think there is some kind of reasons. I mean, that's one of the reasons why. I mean, they don't want this to be a national issue. I think their instruction, I mean, Xi's instructions very clear that Hong Kong government should bear the primary responsibility. I mean, all the Chinese mainland will give whatever the support to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong will have to, put up the request, what Hong Kong wants, and China will try to deliver. And this is this is a Hong Kong issue. So, I mean, if we talk about if the time comes for I mean, what's the word for reckoning, for finding out who is responsible for what? I mean, that will only happen after the outbreak is contained. But if the outbreak is contained very swiftly with the help of the central government, I mean, if Carrie Lam continues to do this job, I mean, it's still possible. But I don't have any inside information on that. I mean, just back to the CE election, as I said earlier. I mean, the CE election, as we all know, will be decided by a very small group of people, the election committee members. So, if Beijing does not want this to be delayed, it doesn't have to be delayed. I mean, of course, that, with this Xi's instruction, there will be more concerns that Hong Kong will be further pulled into China's national orbit and allowing Beijing to exercise tighter political control over the city. Well, I mean, I don't think, there is anything, anyone can do to prevent this from happening. I mean, no matter how one looks at Hong Kong, I mean, its future lies in its further integration with the mainland economically, at least economically. I mean, the key for Hong Kong is that Hong Kong will continue to retain its distinctive advantages, which set itself apart from other Chinese cities. I mean, on that, I'm still very optimistic. I think, Hong Kong still has a great future ahead.
Can I just ask you a quick question just about China's COVID policy? Because a lot of people, myself included, are wondering how long can China keep this zero COVID policy and stay locked off from the world? I mean, they've been doing this now for 2 years. At some point, will this not be a drag on the Chinese economy?
I mean, of course, I think there has been growing calls among the businessmen, the foreign businessmen who work in China, who live and work in China, and there has been growing calls from Chinese businessmen and others who want China to ease up on the restrictions. But I think, as many have written on this, that China is the first to bring the pandemic under control, and China will be the last, probably among the last countries to relax that. I mean, because the Chinese leadership, the Xi Jinping, has made the efforts of sort of bringing the pandemic under control as one of the institutional advantages of the Communist Party. I mean, so they want to make sure that the rest, the pandemic is under control in the rest of the world until China will relax. But however, despite the latest situation in Hong Kong, that the sort of experiences from the Western countries and from the rest of the world have shown that the Omicron, although is very, very infectious, it's highly infectious, but it's less severe in terms of sort of illness and hospitalization and death tolls. And I think that, if you ask me, my view is that maybe 2 or 3 months later, that, so the Omicron that has proved to be less severe. And then, as rest of the world is opening up, I think Beijing will be under further pressure to ease its travel restrictions. If I to make a prediction, I believe as early as in summer, maybe June or July, China will first, China will do this, of course, very gradually, cautiously in steps. And I think in the first step, I think China will probably relax, ease travel restrictions for the business travel. I don't think China will ease restrictions on tourist travel, probably later this year or early next year. But for the business travel, I think it's important that China should consider easing the restrictions, by having the number of days in quarantine cut from 14 to 7, or even less, or 10. I mean, I don't know. I'm really hopeful that this will happen. This is also because I haven't been back to Hong Kong in more than 2 years.
You want to travel too?
Yeah, I want to travel. Everybody wants to travel, and also I think the Chinese government will not fully open up until it gets the signal from the World Health Organization. Once the World WHO, sort of redesignate this virus, and then I think China will sort of just open up. I mean, the impact on the economy is getting bigger and bigger. I mean, the concerns are certainly growing. But I hopefully I'm right on this.
Well, let me keep on Hong Kong for a second, but switch topics. I mean, you came here, I believe, in 1993 as a journalist. You took over. You joined the SCMP in 1996, so you are you got news in your blood. You're a newsman.
Yeah.
Are you concerned about press freedom in Hong Kong, particularly since the closure of Apple Daily, the forced closing of Apple Daily and Stand News, and now the closure of Citizen News? A lot of people talking about press freedom has disappeared in Hong Kong or is being eroded. Are you fearful for press freedom in Hong Kong?
Yeah, but I mean, the press freedom and the free speech had always been, one of the touchiest subjects in Hong Kong, ever since 1997, and sort of particularly so after the implementation of the national security law in the city. But from from what I understand, the Chinese government and Hong Kong authorities have repeatedly said that the law is designed for crimes that threaten national security, and the accurate fact-based journalism will be allowed to continue. And I really hope, that will be the case. And I think, most of the media organizations in Hong Kong have adhered to the accurate and fact-based journalism. And you mentioned the shutdown by Apple Daily, but Beijing and Hong Kong authorities have accused Jimmy Lai, the founder, and the Apple Daily, in sort of going far beyond the scope of journalism. And also, I think a more important point that I want to make, in fact, I have already made it in one of my columns, that the free flow of information and the news is vital, is critical for Hong Kong to maintain its status as Asia's leading financial and business hub. And in addition, I think this is the point that many Chinese officials have not realized, is that China also stands to benefit a great deal from Hong Kong-based media that produce objective, fair, and balanced reports. However, with the hanging sword of the national security law, I mean, there has been rising concerns among some journalists that this will propel them to practice more self-censorship, and I share those concerns. For instance, one question at the back of mind of many journalists, local journalists, is that whether Hong Kong media can continue to criticize the central government, or particularly the CPP and its leadership. And to that question, in fact, I have argued about this in one of my columns. I'll say, why not? I mean, because, Deng Xiaoping, back in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping said on numerous occasions that under the one country, two system formula, that Hong Kong people or media should be able to criticize the CCP. And I find it very difficult to believe that the fair and objective criticism of the CCP and its leadership will be associated with the serious charge of sedition or breaching national security. I mean, in fact, if Keith, you are a regular reader of SCMP, I mean, in SCMP, every day on a daily basis, SCMP has carried its fair share of articles critical of Beijing's policies and official misdeeds and all that. I mean, I believe this, because of the political developments. I mean, this issue will always been a hot issue to talk about. Everybody has, from different backgrounds, have their own opinions. I mean, all I want to say is that, you have to read SCMP or any other Hong Kong newspapers to make the judgments yourself instead of hearing, what people say on the internet. I mean, to us, I mean, to me as an employee of SCMP, I believe that SCMP has never shied away from carrying articles, commentaries, sort of critical of the Chinese government or its leadership. I mean, I'm not here to boast, but if you read my columns, if you go back for the year or the year, more years, most of my columns are critical.
Yeah. So I'm going to put a little appendage at all of my analysis pieces now saying Wang Xiangwei said it's okay to be critical of the Communist Party. So I'm just just putting that out there. I had a few other questions, but we have a lot coming in. So I'm going to use the questions from audience members and wrap my question in because they're very, very similar. Alejandro Reyes from Hong Kong U, my friend and colleague, has a similar question. And he's asking, do you think the Biden Xi Jinping virtual summit has opened the door to a reset in U.S. China relations, or are we heading for a continued period of high tension? I was going to ask a similar question saying, just give us your overview of U.S. China relations. I mean, you still got the trade restrictions in place. Biden hasn't moved on that. You've got a lot of tension, but not a lot of dialogue. What's your take from Beijing?
Sure. I think that as I mentioned earlier, Xi and his allies believe that so long as China focuses on managing its own affairs well, China will overtake U.S. as the largest economy in the world by 2030. I mean, and then, since China is already the elephant in the room, and Xi believes that there was no need to keep the low profile as Deng Xiaoping has said earlier. So he wants, clearly he wants China to be seen as an equal to the United States. And, Washington is neither prepared or willing to accept China as an equal. So hence the confrontation and the fiery rhetoric from both sides. However, in order to grow its economy to be the largest in the world, and as I mentioned earlier, the Communist Party's legitimacy comes from its continuous efforts to improve people's life, and that means that they will have to grow the economy continuously. But for China to do that, China needs a stable international environment. Hence, China's policy of, in Chinese, we call 斗而不破, which literally translates into fight without breaking up. I think this policy from a Beijing point of view will continue to guide in China relationship for this year and the years ahead will be largely shaped by domestic considerations. This year, as we talk about that Xi Jinping is seeking the third term, and the U.S., the midterm elections, and it looks increasingly the case that the virtual meeting between Xi and Biden has succeeded in putting some floor under the spiraling ties. But the volatility will continue, probably many more years before both countries could find effective ways to achieve what one Chinese analyst called the mutually assured peaceful coexistence. I think the chances that that's likely to happen in this decade are not very high. But I do believe that the international sentiments towards China will likely change after, IMF or World Bank, the world, agrees that the Chinese economy becomes the largest. And it's also it's sort of interesting to note. I mean, this I find it very interesting that as the Chinese officials have no longer refrained from airing one of their deeply held suspicions that regarding the China-U.S. relationship is that, from the Chinese officials believe that the certain ultra-right elements in the United States is now seeing China as the yellow peril, and Cui Tiankai, China's former ambassador to Washington, said late last year, in a seminar, sort of public seminar organized by the foreign ministry, he said something to the effect that he believed that the U.S. hostilities were partly driven by the deep-rooted racism. I think that's very interesting. I mean, before Cui Tiankai, I haven't heard anybody else, sort of senior Chinese official, said that, and the sort of Global Times is also no longer shy about talking about the white privilege being embedded in the U.S. global leadership and the policy setting. I guess, what I'm trying to say is the volatility will continue, but I think the meeting between Biden and Xi has really sort of put some floor. I mean, because both sides have clearly spelled out the red lines, over Taiwan, over other stuff. You will continue to see reports that the U.S. will continue to sell weapons to Taiwan, but I think there is a limit. Yeah.
Okay. Well, good. I've got two questions coming in. I'll just lump them together, both involving Taiwan. Associate Member Kevin Ding asking, Taiwan will sooner or later be resolved. Do you think it's going to be resolved peacefully? And then Alejandro Reyes, who we heard from earlier, had asked the question, is she going to make a move when it comes to Taiwan? So can you look in your crystal ball and tell us what's going to happen across the strait?
Okay, that's probably will be one of the recurring questions we can talk about in the years ahead. I find it quite interesting that at the time the West, the United States and the EU are saying that Russia could invade Ukraine, any day. And then there were some people who are wondering whether Xi Jinping will take advantage of this time frame, will invade Taiwan. I don't think that is sort of credible in any way. All those speculation. I mean, China has its own timetable, and I think that's why I'm mentioning that the virtual meeting between Xi and Biden has put some flaws under the spiraling ties, is because in that meeting, after that meeting, the statement from the Chinese side that Xi said something to the effect that China will have patience and all that. So I mean, because for whatever the reasons, I mean, sort of nationalistic reasons being in the United States and China, there are people in the West, in the U.S., in the military saying that China is will be capable of taking over Taiwan as in the next 5 or 6 years, and here in China there are also those nationalistic groups who are arguing for using the military means to take over Taiwan. But I don't think that will really happen in this decade, at least. I mean, because all the talk about whether China's whether China has the military capability to take over Taiwan, I mean, that's really beside the point. Ever since People's Republic was founded in 1949, the Mao's sole mandate, Mao Zedong's sole mandate for PLA was to reunite China to take over Taiwan. And then the Korea War happened, and that really delayed China's timetable, and then the Cultural Revolution and all that. So nothing happened. But the point I want to make is that the PLA has been preparing for taking over Taiwan ever since 1949. So the military thing is not really the issue. I mean, the issue, the real critical issue is, if China does invade Taiwan, will China withstand the sanctions, the economic pressure from U.S. and the rest of the Western world? And I don't think China is really in a hurry, or Xi himself is in a hurry. I mean, because as I mentioned earlier, Xi will probably be in the driving seat in the next 5 or 10 years. So I think all the talk about China is in a hurry to take over Taiwan are really premature. I don't think that will happen. I mean, the example that I give you, that is Mao's, sole mandate for PLA was to prepare to take over Taiwan, and has not happened.
Yeah.
So it's very, on this one, Keith, I must say, it's very difficult to look into the crystal ball. And as the other day I was walking, as part of my exercise, and I listened to BBC, and one commentator said something to the effect, and saying that, regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that analyst said something to the effect that even Putin himself don't know how, when he's going to invade. I guess the same question can be said about mainland and the Taiwan issue.
Good point. We only have a couple of minutes left. I'll ask you one quick question. Sorry, it has to be quick because we only have a couple minutes for our hour time. From Karen Malmstrom, former Vice President of the FCC. I'll just summarize it. She just asked, what is Beijing's real future plan or idea for Hong Kong?
Well,
you're up there. What do they, when they look down here, do they see a troublemaking place they just want to get rid of, or do they see something that's important? Or
no longer. I mean, because if back in 2019, that was probably the view. But now, after the national security law was imposed, and then after the stability has returned, that I think as I mentioned earlier, Hong Kong's unique advantages of its proximity to the mainland, as a gateway to China, as a free port, its capital way of living and the rule of law. Those are the things Hong Kong has not lost. So long as Hong Kong maintains those advantages, it still will become a magnet for Chinese money, not only the Chinese money, but also the overseas money. I could give you an example. It's like that I'm told that after the U.S. strengthened the scrutiny of Chinese companies listed in New York, I mean, the line to get listed in Hong Kong is getting longer and longer. Usually it takes about 3 months to process approval. Now the waiting time is 6 months or even longer. And all the talk about Hong Kong's political crackdown and tight quarantine controls have put off the international bankers. I would take those with a pinch of salt. Hong Kong will continue to remain the magnet for China's brightest talents, particularly those overseas Chinese who are educated in the US and elsewhere in the West. I mean, they will replace those bankers choosing to live in a heartbeat. But more importantly, bankers flow where the money is. And Hong Kong, I believe, is still the place where big money is made.
Well, great. And I've got one last question for you, and it's something I ask all of our Zoom panelists, which is when you're not on Zoom and you're not writing your column, what are you reading? What can you recommend our members and our viewers in this Zoom pick up and read, because we're all stuck in quarantine. We can't go out and have a drink after 6 p.m. So we got a lot of time to read a book. What do you recommend?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's funny that you asked that. I mean, because because of the rules. I mean, even though I'm afraid to go anywhere in Beijing, but still with this Olympics, travel, I mean the traffic restrictions and all that. I've been mostly work from home, so I also spend a lot of time on reading it, and I just sort of started a book club last week, 2 weeks ago. So the book me and my friends have chosen is the one which I'm reading right now. Is a very interesting biography. Not really a biography. I mean, it's written by two Russian analysts at the Brookings Institute. It's about Putin, and the English. I'm reading the Chinese translation. I mean, because now I'm in China, it's very difficult to buy any English language books in Hong Kong and have them mailed to China. So it's almost impossible. So I bought the Chinese translation. It's called, in English, it's called Mr. Putin, the Operative in the Kremlin. It's written by Fiona Hill and Clifford Gaddy of the Brookings Institute. I mean, the reason that I'm drawn to this book is that on the front cover, it's saying that this book is recommended by Vice President Joseph Biden. When Biden was the vice president, the book was written and published in 2015, and it's also said was recommended by the MI6 chief from the United Kingdom. So it's like this.
Mr. Putin, the operative in the Kremlin.
Yeah.
And our speaker tonight was Mr. Wang Xiangwei, columnist for the South China Morning Post. If you're not reading his column in the SCMP, you're missing everything going on about China. Xiangwei, thank you very much for doing this. Just promise me that when the borders open up and we can travel again, you'll come back and you'll come to the FCC and we can see you in person.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us in the Zoom here at the Foreign Correspondents Club, Hong Kong. This is the sort of thing we do. Keep in mind, come on, check out our website, come join us in Zoom. Again, Xiangwei, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for joining. Bye-bye.
Okay, good night. Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.